Dimitri, you're muted. Dimitri, hello? You are muted. We don't hear you.
Hear me now? Can people in Zoom hear me now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Oh, so you didn't hear me when I just said, if you're on Zoom and your camera's on, everyone in the room can see you right now. You're up on the wall. So if you're uncomfortable with that, you might want to turn off your video. Okay. So the talk is going to go for about 45 minutes, I think, something like 45 minutes. And then there'll be a short break, and then we'll have about an hour for Q&A. So if you're joining over Zoom, if you have a question that you'd like to ask during Q&A, message me directly, and I'll add you to the queue. Finally, it's the custom here at Australian Catholic University to give an acknowledgement of country. So we commence our meeting by acknowledging the First Peoples and the traditional custodians of the country where Dianoia is located, the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge their elders, past and present, and remember that they have passed on their wisdom to us in various ways. Let us hold this in trust as we work together and serve our communities. So let me introduce the speaker, Professor Chalmers. He's a university professor of philosophy and neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University, co-director of the Phil Papers Foundation, the author of over 100 papers and several books in philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, metaphysics, epistemology, and several other areas of philosophy. The latest book is titled Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. And today he's going to be talking to us about skepticism and the simulation argument. So join me in welcoming.
Okay, thank you very much, Dimitri, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real honor to be giving this talk today, and a special pleasure to be giving it in person after such a long period where this wasn't possible. It's my own first time back in Australia for about 2.5 years, and yeah, great pleasure to be able to visit the Dianoia Institute at the same time. This is the lecture, the annual seminar in metaphysics and epistemology. So I thought I'd pick a theme with elements of both of those, especially epistemology. Issues connecting a rather traditional issue, namely skepticism, to a rather less traditional issue, the simulation argument, which is an argument probably most closely associated with Nick Bostrom for taking seriously the idea that we might be living in a simulation. These are themes I talk about a fair amount in a recent book, Reality Plus, which talks quite a lot about simulation and skepticism. It has one chapter just with going into issues about the simulation argument in a little depth and drawing out some connections to skepticism. Today, I'm going to try and develop those connections in a little more depth, partly knowing that there's really a whole lot of experts in these epistemological issues here in this room, and I'm looking forward to getting feedback. So the topic is simulation and skepticism and the simulation argument. The aim is to analyze the simulation argument, try and develop the best version of it that I can with a view to determining its impact on skepticism about the external world, because I do think that one of the more interesting upshots of the simulation argument may be for issues about skepticism. The simulation argument should be distinguished from the simulation hypothesis, which is a more general topic. The simulation hypothesis says roughly that we are living, it's the hypothesis that we are living in a computer simulation. Hypothesis made very familiar in movies like, The Matrix, where Neo seems to be living in a regular world at the beginning of the movie, but turns out to be living in a computer-generated world in which all his inputs are coming from this computer simulation, and his actions are being fed back to that computer simulation. So yeah, I gloss this as we're receiving inputs from and sending outputs to an artificially designed computer simulation of a world. Here, the Matrix is the paradigm. Here's a picture of a scene in the Matrix. This is actually an illustration from that book, Reality Plus. I got a marvelous illustrator, Tim Peacock, who did 57 illustrations for this book, illustrating some of the key ideas. This is a scene with Trinity and the Oracle. For those of you who saw the sequels, they both inhabit the simulation in slightly different ways. Trinity is a biological being with a brain, like a brain in a vat or a body in a pod, hooked up to the simulation, while the Oracle is basically an AI being, one of the machines herself, a creature of the simulation hooked up to the simulation. So here you get to have that difference depicted. One bit of terminology I like is to distinguish biosims from pure sims. A biosim is like a brain in a vat or a biological creature connected to a simulation, while a pure sim is a simulated creature in a simulation. So that Trinity is a biosim and the Oracle is a pure sim. I'm going to mostly focus on the pure sim case in this talk, although the biosim case will occasionally be relevant. And yeah, the simulation argument raises is of course very closely connected to a long tradition of scenarios that people invoke when thinking about skepticism. I mean, there's a long line going back from how do you know you're not dreaming right now, and how do you know all this isn't an illusion, to Descartes' famous case, how do you know you're not being fooled by an evil demon right now who's generating experiences as of a normal world when none of it is real. Here we have kind of a hybrid scenario depicted here with the evil demon actually doing its work by manipulating a computer simulation being fed to a brain in a vat. And the brain in a vat has figured out that it exists in the Cartesian way, but still is having worries about the external world. So the simulation hypothesis is, often viewed as continuous with this scenario, with this long line of skeptical hypotheses, and can be used to cast doubt on our knowledge of the external world. So here is a classic Cartesian argument for external world skepticism, is fleshed out using the simulation scenario. Now, premise one, we don't know that we're not living in a simulation. Premise two, if we don't know we're not living in a simulation, we don't know we have hands. Conclusion, we don't know we have hands. And the thought there is that we have hands is just fairly arbitrary. This can be used for just about any concrete claim about the external world. That, I'm in Melbourne right now. There's a bunch of people here. That's a chair. I was born in Australia, whatever. The thought is that, the first premise seems plausible, at least prima facie, because the thought is that if we were in a simulation, everything would seem just the same. So it's awfully hard to rule that out. The second premise is plausible because it seems that, well, if we were in a simulation, then we wouldn't have hands, at least if it's not one of those simulations where your body's in a pod with hands. If it was in a simulation, there wouldn't actually be all these chairs in the room with me. So if I can't exclude that I'm living in a simulation, I can't exclude that I don't have hands, there are no chairs, and so on. And from there, you can conclude, I don't know I have hands, I don't know if there are chairs in this room, and so on. So that's a classical rendition of a skeptical argument, just using the simulation hypothesis. You know, it's very continuous with things that can be done with the evil demon hypothesis, the dream hypothesis, and so on. I'll concentrate on the simulation hypothesis today, but a fair amount of it generalizes. I don't claim it generalizes to every skeptical argument and skeptical scenario, but this is a start. I've written quite a lot in the past connecting the simulation hypothesis to issues about skepticism. First in an article called "The Matrix as Metaphysics," maybe 20 years ago. And then there's quite a lot in this recent book, Reality Plus. The focus of that work is rather different from my main focus today. In earlier work, I focused really on the second premise of the argument, the one that says, if we don't know we're not living in a simulation, we don't know we have hands, by arguing for what I call simulation realism. That's the thesis that if we're in a computer simulation, most of our ordinary external world beliefs, like I have hands, are in fact true. You know, standard view for in a simulation, I don't really have hands, there's not really a table in front of me. And so on my view, if we're in a simulation, I still have hands, there's still a table in front of me. It's just, you know, I'm living in a digital world. This is a digital table. These are perhaps ultimately digital hands, but they're still real. They're still real. And my beliefs say that I have hands are true. If that's right, that removes at least the key support for premise 2 of the skeptical argument, which is grounded in the idea that if we're in a simulation, we don't have hands, and provides one way of responding to this kind of skeptical argument. I mean, there's still a lot to say. This doesn't defeat all Cartesian skeptical arguments, certainly doesn't defeat all reasons for worrying about skepticism, but at least, again, it's a start. So previous work, I've concentrated on this second premise and its support. Today, I'm going to be much more interested in the first premise, the premise that says, we don't know we're not in a simulation. I mean, this is actually more central, I think. This kind of issue is more central for most classic responses to external world skepticism. Most responses to skepticism tend to question premise 1, arguing that we can know in one way or another that we aren't in a simulation or the equivalent. I don't know, you know, Moore with demonstrating his hand says, yeah, I know that we have hands and therefore that I'm not in a simulation. Russell argues that the ordinary world hypothesis is the best explanation of our experiences. Various dogmatist and externalist responses go in that direction. So, but today I want to focus on premise 1 and actually try to support premise 1 of the skeptical argument using the simulation argument as support for the argument. If that's right, then in a way, you know, that helps the skeptic by making the case that the first premise of this argument is reasonably secure. If that's right, then anti-skeptical responses to this argument must focus on premise 2. So think about this as a way of indirectly making the case that, you know, if you want to respond to the skeptic, you have to focus on the second premise more than people have done. And for making the case for, say, simulation realism as a strategy worth taking seriously. But as I say, I'm mostly going to focus just on that first premise in its own right, the one that says we don't know, we're not living in a simulation. I mean, for some people, that might be obvious already, in which case, fine, then all this stuff is just going to be a bonus. But, you know, lots of people have found various ways to resist this claim by saying, you know, even if it's somehow, even if there's some sense in which, for example, you can't be certain that you're not living in a simulation, maybe you still get to know it one way or another. The stuff I'm going to be saying is hopefully going to be relevant to many of those views, and at least hopefully will make it harder to make the case that we can know that we're not in a simulation. Okay, so here's the plan. Roughly 3 parts for the talk. In the first part, I will outline, you know, basically the best version that I can of the simulation argument. I'll go through a few versions from simpler to more complex and more general, outline at least my own preferred version. I'll then defend key premises of the simulation argument to defend the argument as a whole. And then I'll look at the conclusion of the argument and explore the consequences of that conclusion for issues about knowledge and skepticism. I mean, the issues here are at least initially non-technical. Towards the middle and the end, some slightly more technical issues in both formal, informal, and formal epistemology will come up. I know that, again, people here are much more expert on some of these things than I am, so I'm going to be glad to get feedback on those things. Okay, first, the simulation argument. As I said, it's most closely associated with Nick Bostrom. The earliest version of the simulation argument that I've been able to find is by the roboticist and futurist Hans Moravec in a 1992 essay called Pigs in Cyberspace, which the quote I've got here actually comes from a 1995 interview with Wired magazine. And this version of the simulation argument is kind of just a straightforward argument that the simulation hypothesis is probable. And what Moravec says is, well, in fact, robots will recreate us any number of times in simulations, whereas the original unsimulated version of our world exists at most only once. Therefore, statistically speaking, it's much more likely that we're living in a vast simulation than in the original unsimulated universe. So that's, this is basically a simple version of the simulation argument that says most beings are going to be simulated, therefore we're probably simulated. So here's a way to represent it. Premise one, most human-like beings are sims. I'll explain the terminology in a second. Second, if most human-like beings are sims, we are probably sims. Conclusion, we are probably sims. Okay, so sims here are beings in simulations. I think as I'm understanding it here, it's going to be consistent with either being pure sims or biosims in simulations. But the case I'll focus on will be the pure sims. Non-sims are beings not in simulations, like people just connected to an ordinary unsimulated world. Human-like beings are, well, in the first instance, beings with experiences like ours, whose experience of the world is phenomenologically like our experiences. There's a question here about whether you want this to be exactly like ours. If you require, exact, sort of being exactly like, say, my experiences in every last detail, maybe that's going to be extremely rare. And no other beings in the universe, even simulated beings, may have exactly those experiences. So for this notion of human-like beings, maybe what really matters is something like beings with experiences relevantly like ours. We're not going to require, for example, that they get exactly the same shade of red at some point in the background of the visual field. I think this can be cashed out by saying a feature of experiences relevantly like ours if the only differences are roughly probabilistically independent of the hypothesis that we're in a simulation. That is, changes in that feature don't make it more or less likely that we are in a simulation. This allows us to bring in a much broader class of experiences, and I'll return to that issue a bit later on. But for now, just think of human-like beings as beings with experiences relevantly like ours, and most, and probably here, somewhat arbitrary, but at least you want them to be aligned with each other. Maybe understand most as meaning 99% and probably as meaning a 0.99. I'll end up understanding these things as rational credences. So, okay, premise one, most human-like beings are sims. Moravec, I'll talk in a second about the argument for that. Premise two is, in some ways, the philosophical key. If most beings with experiences like this are sims, then I am probably a sim, and we are probably a sims. By the way, I tend to use we in these arguments rather than I, mostly to be kind of inclusive. Maybe there's a case, especially where skeptical arguments are concerned, I really ought to be using I, because I'm not even entitled to the hypothesis that any of you guys exist. So if you prefer, just turn my we's all into I's. If most human-like beings are sims, I am probably a sim. Therefore, I'm probably a sim. And the thought is, given that at least conditional on most human-like beings being sims, there's at least a prima facie case that it's more likely that I'd be one of the sims than one of the non-sims. But I'll get into that issue more in what follows. So here's the kind of the statistical reasoning. It's like if maybe for every 10 non-sim populations of, say, a species like humanity, maybe out of every 10, at least 1 in 10 of those is going to create 1,000 simulations of just that many beings. So in the end, we'll have sim populations outnumbering non-sim populations by, say, 100 to 1. And let's say they have relevantly similar experiences. You might then think, okay, there's a case that it's actually roughly 100 to 1 on that we are sims rather than that we are non-sims. So that's kind of the case for the second premise, at least. Why accept the first premise? I think, Moravec is at least giving a tacit argument here. If we spell it out, I think he says most directly is a version of premise 2 that non-sims will end up creating many sims. But to spell it out, a few more tacit assumptions. Premise 1: human-like sims are possible. Simulated worlds of simulated creatures with experiences like ours are possible. If they're possible, human-like non-sims will create many of them. And maybe tacit behind that is there'll be various motives to create many simulations, maybe for the purposes of entertainment, maybe for the purposes of science, maybe for the purposes of, I don't know, prediction, maybe for the purposes of studying history, and so on. It's funny, if it's possible, it seems like prima facie case that many of those non-sims will be, many simulated universe will be created. Premise 3: if human-like non-sims create many human-like sims, most human-like beings are sims. I guess that's guaranteed if you understand many in the right way, although I'll come back to that. Conclusion: most human-like beings are sims. So that's just some prima facie reasoning for the first premise. I don't say claim by any means this is conclusive, but that's something like that. I think is Moravec's reasoning. Now, I think there's also a very natural case against premise 1 that that was premise 1 of the Moravec argument, which is that most human-like beings are sims. The case against that is, well, that's just extremely speculative. And the argument for premise 1 is highly speculative, talking about what's possible in principle and the motivations of and actions of various hypothetical systems. Each premise, it seems, could fail in various ways. But that then leads, I think, to a refined version of the simulation argument, which we obtain by systematizing the ways in which, say, the Moravec style argument can fail. And that way, I think we can still get an interesting conclusion. And one way of viewing Bostrom's argument is he's doing a version of this. He's systematizing at least a couple of ways that the Moravec argument can fail, and he still gets an interesting conclusion. So Bostrom's argument is not an argument for we're probably in a simulation. I mean, it's sometimes read that way, but what he actually says explicitly, it's an argument for a three-way disjunction. Either we're probably in a simulation, or most civilizations die before they can make simulations, or most civilizations choose not to make simulations. Somehow there's an extra or got in there. Oh, at least the or is in the wrong place. But here the thought is, these correspond to at least two ways that the Moravec argument could fail. Here are some reasons why it wouldn't be the case that many simulated universes are created, because civilizations die before they have that capability, or they have the capability, but they choose not to use it. And then I think you could outline a version of the simulation argument looks like this. Assuming H2 and H3 are false, that is, assuming that beings don't die off in term, don't die off first, and assuming that they actually manifest their capacities to create simulations, then most human-like beings are sims. Second, if most human-like beings are sims, we're probably sims, as before. Conclusion, if not H2 or H3, we're probably sims, and that's the a version of the disjunctive conclusion that he talked about. I'll talk a bit later whether that should really be understood as a disjunction or some kind of conditional. Sorry, that's a repeat. No, I think Bostrom's argument is interesting. I mean, and somewhat more sophisticated than the Moravec argument because it brings in these couple of ways that the key premise could be false. That most human-like beings are Sims could be false. My own view, though, is that this style of elaboration of the simulation argument in Bostrom doesn't go nearly far enough. There are many other ways in which this claim that most human-like beings are Sims could fail beyond H2 or H3. And my view is they should be treated as roughly parallel. I mean, one claim, for example, one thing that people often say is that, well, in a simulation, there wouldn't be genuine human-like consciousness, maybe because you think that consciousness is not a computational property and doesn't supervene on computational properties. So the AI systems can't be conscious. If you think that, then you'll think that at least in a pure simulation, there won't be human-like consciousness. And yeah, no Sim will be a human-like being. Therefore, it won't be the case that most human-like beings are Sims. I mean, I think there's a lot to say to that. My own view is that simulations can have human-like consciousness. Furthermore, we could also, at this point, invoke the possibility of biosims as opposed to pure Sims. But for present purposes, I think it makes sense just to list this as another possible alternative. In a moment, I'm going to call all of these Sim blockers. They're basically ways to block the claim that most human-like beings are Sims in light of the prima facie Moravec reasoning. Another Sim blocker is that physics might turn out to be uncomputable. Just say it turns out that, as say, Roger Penrose thinks there are uncomputable processes in physics, then no classical computer, at least, will be able to simulate the physics of this universe. Again, there's a lot to say to that. Couldn't we bring in special new forms of computers like quantum computers, quantum gravity computers, if Penrose is right, that all this arises in quantum gravity? But anyway, list this as a potential Sim blocker. You might worry that the base universe doesn't have enough power to support simulations. Another Sim blocker is we might make many Sims, but we'll make many even more non-Sims. Maybe we'll make a whole lot of AI systems and simulations. We'll make even more, let's say, robots outside simulations, in which case non-Sims will end up outnumbering Sims. My own view is that, I mean, a couple of these Bostrom mentions and calls just assumptions that these things are false, but I think it's, it makes more sense to treat these on a par with H2 or H3, especially if we don't know that they're true. We don't know whether they're true. So I'd end up going for this somewhat more general strategy. Let's say a Sim blocker is a true proposition that explains why most human-like beings are not Sims, if indeed that's the case, perhaps in light of the prima facie Moravec argument that most beings are Sims. And I think H2 to H7, the two Bostrom hypotheses and the four I just mentioned, are examples of those. We'll die first, we'll choose not to make Sims, consciousness isn't simulable, physics isn't simulable, there's not enough computer power, or we'll make even more non-Sims. I think those are all examples of Sim blockers. And I'll call proposition Sim blocker is just the proposition that there is a Sim blocker. That can be in, maybe a disjunction of H2 through H7 together with any other Sim blockers if they need to be added. If so, this then gives us a generalized form of the simulation argument, which is roughly the form that I like. First premise, absent Sim blockers. As if there are no Sim blockers, most human-like beings are Sims. Second premise, if most human-like beings are Sims, we are probably Sims. Conclusion, absent Sim blockers, we are probably Sims. And the first premise is just a somewhat more general version, at least of my regimentation of the Bostrom argument. And the second premise is a version of this indifference style reasoning, which I'll get to. There's a question about how all the conditionals and the probablys are to be understood. There's also So I think it's useful to formalize this a little bit. Let's go with, yeah, sim blockers is the proposition. There are sim blockers, mostly sims is the proposition that most human-like beings are sims. We are sims. We're in a simulation. I'm in a simulation, if you like. And I'll use CR here for just rational credence. Then I think we can formalize the argument roughly like this. The rational credence to have in mostly sims, given there are no sim blockers, is 1. That's roughly to say I think you can understand sim blockers. There's basically an entailment. If there are no sim blockers, then it follows there are mostly sims pretty much by definition. Second premise, the credence in where sims, given that most human-like beings are sims, is high. That's a key premise, which will involving a kind of indifference reasoning that I'll come back to. Conclusion, the rational credence in where sims, given there are no sim blockers, is high. Here I've put the argument explicitly as a conditional credence claim. You can unpack it if you want as to something a little bit more like a disjunction in the Bostrom style. So yeah, we did have, the rational credence to have in where sims, given there are no sim blockers, is high. So, oh, sorry, I think I actually put the, so credence in, oh no, yeah, where sims, given no sim blockers. Yeah, rational credence in where sims, given no sim blockers, is high. If so, then it's like the unconditional credence to have in the disjunction, sim blockers or we are sims, is high. Interestingly, I don't think you're quite entitled to the Bostrom style conclusion that either one of those sim blockers obtains or we are probably sims, but you do get something very close. And I think this conclusion is interesting, still interesting. I mean, it's much weaker than the Moravec conclusion that we probably are simulations. But instead you go, probably either there are sim blockers or we are simulations. But that's interesting because each of the sim blockers is itself interesting. I find them all to be somewhat surprising if true, that all beings will die out first before making simulations, or that people will choose not to, or that consciousness can't be simulated, or the physics can't be simulated. All of those would be interesting and substantive conclusions. Arguably, none of those sim blockers is so clear that we should have a high credence that there are sim blockers. I think very plausibly, I think we don't know that any of those sim blockers is correct. So that already, you might think already from there, that tends to suggest the possibility of an argument for that we don't know we are not sims, although the chain of reasoning is far from obvious. I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, but that's then okay to lay out my preferred version of the simulation argument. Now I'll try to defend the key premises. I need water, by the way. I've got a tiny bit here. No, okay, nothing. Okay, I'll hold on to these last drops with my life. Okay, defending the argument. Premise 1 of the generalized argument is fairly trivial, I think, if you understand it right. Premise 1 said, absent sim blockers, most human-like beings are sims. Basically, this is just to say that if it's not the case that most human-like beings are sims, then there's some explanation of why that's not the case in light of the Moravec style argument that it should be the case, which is, the Moravec argument said it's possible that most human-like beings are sims, and if it's possible, some people will make it the case. Then if that's not the case, then okay, there'll be some reason why it's not possible, or there'll be some reason why non-sims don't create all those sims which are possible. So this just requires that if most human-like beings are not sims, there's some explanation of why the prima facie argument fails. I suppose you could worry about a scenario where it ends up being true that most human-like beings are not sims, but there's no explanation of that fact. Therefore, nothing that qualifies as a sim blocker. I guess the way I'm thinking about it it's going to have to be the case that one of those premises of the Moravec argument fails if its conclusion fails, and even locating the failed premise will be good enough for a sim blocker by my way of dividing things up. I really think premise 2, I think, is much more where most of the philosophical action is. So that's where I'll focus now. Premise 2 is basically, that's the one that says if most human-like beings are sims, then I'm probably a sim. That seems to be like an instance of what people call indifference principles. It says, given enough beings, given beings which are alike in certain relevant ways, we should be indifferent among the relevant hypotheses. In particular, this is a version of the kind of indifference principle which I think is more popular than many other indifference principles, focused on hypotheses about oneself based on the kinds of experiences that one has. So a general form of this would be the credence that the rational credence that I have property phi, given that the fraction of me-like beings with phi is x, is x. Okay, so f phi here is the fraction of beings with experiences like mine who are phi. So let's just suppose that 99% of beings with experiences like mine are in a simulation. Then the indifference principle licenses the idea that conditional on 99% of beings with experiences like mine being in a simulation, I should have credence 0.99 that I'm in a simulation. This reasoning will work for instances of phi other than being in a simulation, but that's the one I use. Thanks very much, Dimitri. I think probably the fundamental form of this principle, you could put in various ways of filling out me-like here. Some people prefer to do it with evidence. I like doing it with experiences. And here, a me-like being is a being with experience. In the first instance, I think this works for experiences just like mine. Just say, we knew that 99% of the beings with experiences exactly like mine were in simulations. Then that would license 0.99 that I'm in a simulation. But I think one can also extend this to what I here call quasi-me-like beings, beings with experiences relevantly like mine. That's the distinction I mentioned earlier on. That is, they differ from mine only in respects which are probabilistically or evidentially independent of being phi, like change some small details in the background of a visual field has no impact on the probability that we're in a simulation. This allows us to extend the indifference principle, the one that quantifies over this broader class of quasi-me-like beings, which I think helps make the argument somewhat more broadly applicable, but I won't make too much heavy weather of that distinction. Okay, indifference principles are somewhat controversial. So if you're going to resist the simulation argument, one of the best places to resist is indifference, is through the indifference principles. Brian Weatherson has a fairly old piece using, resisting Bostrom's reasoning by focusing on the indifference principles and saying these aren't generally true. I don't think he focuses, so much on the key form that I've brought in here. For my purposes, I don't think I need the full strength indifference principle outline. What I like is something more like a prima facie indifference principle, which is something like prima facie, one should be indifferent among various me-like beings, among the hypothesis I'm this me-like being and that me-like being and that me-like being in stories about the universe, unless there's some specific reason to favor some of those beings over others. So in this way of doing it, it's kind of dialectical. There are challenges, specific challenges to indifference reasoning. We can consider those challenges, and that's precisely what I'll do here. Are there, in fact, some specific reasons not to be indifferent among various me-like beings? I think there are two very natural challenges to bring in. The first one is that I can exclude some of these me-like beings because I stand in some special relation to them, like perhaps I created them. The other source, which I'll consider in a moment, comes from externalism about evidence. But let me let me start with the first kind of objection. This leads to a fairly common style of response to to Bostrom's simulation argument. Bostrom sometimes puts a simulation argument not in these generic terms, but in terms of we will eventually create many simulations. Therefore, most beings like us are simulations. Therefore, we should have high credence that we're in a simulation, which to many people seems weird because, hang on, didn't we create those simulated beings? Don't we thereby know that if we created them, then we are not them? Yeah, that's one way to resist this kind of indifference reasoning. I think at this point, Bostrom wants to bite the bullet and say, even after you go through this act of creating a whole bunch of beings like you, it's possible, it's just as possible that you're one of the created beings as the original being. If you created 100 of them, there was only one of you, and you created 100 beings with experiences exactly like yours after the case, then it's 100 to 1 on that you're one of the created beings. This is a style of reasoning that's familiar to philosophers from Adam Elgar's case of Dr. Evil. I can't remember exactly how it goes. They're trying to defeat Dr. Evil, who's about to destroy the earth, and they tell Dr. Evil they've created 100 exact copies of him, and if he presses the button to destroy Earth, all 100 of those people will suffer intense agony forever. And then the thought is Dr. Evil should now say, oh, well, it's 99% that I'm one of the created beings, so it's 99% that if I press the button, I'll feel agony. Again, this is controversial. Some people think that Dr. Evil can exclude at least under certain circumstances, can exclude the hypothesis he's one of the created beings. He knows he's the original. And you might think in the Bostrom case, yeah, if I created them, I know I'm not them. The question is, does he really know that he created them, or does he just have the experience of creating them? What this brings out, I think, is that if you're prepared to take on board the Bostrom-Elgar style reasoning that in these cases you can't rule out you're one of the created beings, then even the Bostrom style argument will go through okay. But if you're uncomfortable with this, I think there's another thing you can do, which is basically exclude those beings from the relevant reference class and just apply your indifference beings to your indifference principle to a population that excludes the sims which are downstream from you, the sims that you create. I mean, I think this actually brings out two different versions of the simulation argument, and it's a distinction which I think is worth making between what I call first-person versions of the simulation argument versus impersonal versions of the simulation argument. The first-person simulation argument is, I think both of these are actually present to some extent in Bostrom, but some of the time he runs what I call the first-person simulation argument, which the key premise is about us and what we will create. The key premise is that absent sim blockers, we will create many simulations just like us, and therefore we're probably a simulation. And that's the one that makes a lot of people queasy because, hang on, didn't you say we created them? But there's also an impersonal version of the simulation, which I greatly prefer, where the key premise is not about us, but about non-simulated creatures in general. Key premise is that absent sim blockers, non-sims will create simulations. And that's just a general claim about what you might expect non-simulated populations to do, at least if there are enough of them. If you buy that general version, I think the thought is, well, that will still go through, even if we exclude the sims we create from the reference class and just focus on other non-simulated beings, beings elsewhere in the universe, beings in the first universe up. We can still, make the case that at least absent certain sim blockers, then we should expect that most human-like beings will be sims. Of course, this does raise to salience certain sim blockers, like maybe it makes even more salient these non-sims we don't know anything about. Maybe they won't in fact choose to create simulations, but I think but the formal structure of the argument will still go through. Okay, so that's roughly how I would treat the creation worry. I want to spend a bit more time worrying about the objection from external evidence. I mean, partly because I know lots of people here think about externalism in epistemology, externalism about evidence. and so on. You might think what inference principles really require is that beings share our evidence, and plenty of people think evidence goes beyond what's merely our conscious experiences. If you adopt so-called phenomenal conception of evidence, then beings will share our evidence if and only if they share our phenomenal experiences. If you think evidence goes beyond, then you might think, okay, well, we need to be much more restricted in applying these principles. In particular, just say you adopt the orthodox view that if you're a simulation, when you experience seeing a table, you're not really seeing a table. I mean, my view is that even Sims, when they experience seeing a table, typically they are seeing a table. But I won't assume that view of my own. Most people think that if you're in a simulation, when you seem to be seeing a table, you're not in fact seeing a table. If that's so, you may, okay, when a non-sim sees a table, they actually have as evidence, the table, they're seeing the table, and so on. Well, the non-sims don't share that external evidence. They just share the phenomenology. If that's right, then you can make the case that our evidence excludes them from the relevant reference class of beings that share our evidence, and premise 2 will fail. And that's a case that Weatherson makes in his argument about indifference principles. I want to resist this to at least some extent. I at least want to say that at least conditional on the claim that most people with my experience are sims, then your external evidence no longer justifies accepting or having a high credence in I am not a sim. I mean, this roughly corresponds to cases that people talk about as cases of defeat. Maybe a non-sim who sees a table gets some special justification they're seeing a table. But then if they were to be told that in fact only 1 in 100 people with experiences like this are genuinely seeing a table, then the reasonable attitude for them would be to not to accept they're seeing a table. I think here one can run through a bunch of relevantly similar cases to work up to this. I mean, say I'm told that half the people in the world selected randomly have been given a hallucination drug, where most of what they experience is not real. I have experiences as of a table in front of me. In fact, I wasn't given the drug. I've got no special indication of that. Then should I accept that there's a table here, or I'm seeing a table? Very strong intuition here. No, I should have credence 0.5 in this. I know that half the people in this situation are not seeing a table, and my situation is not in any way special. I should have credence around 0.5 in this. And Jonathan Vogel, Roger White consider some cases a little bit like this, making this kind of case. Here's another one, moving a little bit closer to the simulation scenario. Say I'm told that in 9 out of 10 countries of the world, all apparent zebras in zoos are holograms. In fact, my country is one of the exceptions, so I have no indication of this. I'm in a zoo, I have an experience as of a zebra. Should I accept that's a zebra? Very strong intuition. No, I should have credence around 0.1 that this is a zebra, because I should figure chances 9 out of 10 that I'm in one of the hologram countries. And the fact that I'm actually seeing a zebra doesn't really move me off that. Or to move now much closer to the simulation case, say I'm told that in 9 out of 10 worlds, all apparent tables are simulations. Maybe when God created us, she deliberately made 9 simulations for every non-simulation. So if 9 out of 10 worlds, all parent tables are simulations. In fact, I'm in a non-sim world, got no special indication of this. I have an experience as of a table. Should I accept that's a table, or that's an unsimulated table if you think simulated tables are still tables? Again, I think, no, I should have credence 0.1 in this. You might think, okay, an externalist, you're an internalist about evidence, an externalist about evidence shouldn't say that. My own view is even an externalist about evidence can accept these verdicts. These are verdicts where external evidence is defeated by further information about, maybe if you never knew that 9 out of 10 countries, or that had holograms, or that 1 out of 2 people had been taking the drug, maybe then you would have had evidence for there's a zebra and so on. But once people have this special information about 9 out of 10 countries and 1 out of 2 people having had the hallucination drug, it is natural, I think, to hold that's a case where your external evidence is defeated by that further information. Don't know, Vogel might have these cases. I haven't seen explicit responses to this stuff by externalists, but I don't know the literature that well. Certainly there is plenty of externalists are happy to go along with defeat. Now there is this radical externalist view which I've seen developed in most detail by Maria Lassen and Arnio, where these alleged defeaters don't really defeat your knowledge at all. For example, she's got a case involving knowing that 1 out of 2 people have brains in vats and so on, but relevantly similar case, the zebra case would be relevantly similar. And it looks like she'd say your knowledge that there's a zebra there is not undermined by this extra knowledge that 9 out of 10 zoos contain holograms, not zebras. It doesn't undermine those, but its status as knowledge at all. That said, she still allows that the belief that there are zebras is unreasonable, making a distinction between what's reasonable to believe and what you know. She thinks you're still in a position to know that there are zebras there, and if you go with it, you'll know it, but she thinks it's nevertheless unreasonable to believe it. So this leads to this rather counterintuitive combination of you know it, but it's not reasonable to believe it. If you apply that to the simulation case, I think that leads to one possible way out, leads to a view where we know we are non-sims, but it's not reasonable to believe this. And maybe it's going to turn out the reasonable belief is that we are probably sims. I mean, I find that conclusion rather awkward, but it's at least worth bringing out in mapping the logical space. And certainly I'm sure there are going to be more radical externalists still who are going to drop the stuff about reasonableness and just go with, in this situation, but again, I think the prima facie case is against that. Okay, so that's those are, I think, the 2 most important objections to the second premise about indifference. There are more objections to the argument we can bring up. I think most of them are handled one way or another by this structure. But I think I should move on to part 3, which is consequences of the conclusion. And its upshot for knowledge and skepticism. Remember, the conclusion said, absent sim blockers, we are probably sims, or put in rational credence form. Credence in we are sims, given there are no sim blockers, should be high. Credence in we are sims or sim blockers is high. Question, what does this establish? Can we get from here to the thing we wanted to get to, which is we can't know we're not sims? Okay, first of all, does this conclusion get us to the Moravec style conclusion? We are sims? No, I don't think it does. It doesn't get there. It doesn't get to that we know we're sims. Doesn't get that we should accept we're sims. Why? There are all those sim blockers that we definitely can't rule out. And given that we can't rule out the sim blockers, we definitely can't know using this reasoning that we're sims. But still, if the conclusion is correct, that the conditional probability in we are sims given sim blockers is high, then at the very least, the credence we should give to we are sims should be close to the credence we give to sim blockers. And maybe we can use that combined with some claims about sim blockers to get somewhere. I mean, plausibly, I would say we're not in a position to know that there are sim blockers. Each of those sim blockers is highly speculative, and none of them, I think, is something that we can know to obtain. So I'd say we're not in a position to know sim blockers, where K here is a position to know operator. Can we combine that with our conclusion to get to we can't know we are sims? You can get close, but not quite there. Here's a tempting argument. Let's first look at the version without probably there. We say we're in a position to know sim blockers or we are sims. We're not in a position to know sim blockers. Okay, the first is meant to be a version of our earlier conclusion. The second is a version of what we just discussed. We're not in a position to know sim blockers. Conclusion, using reasonably plausible principle, we're not in a position to know we are sims. Oh, great, that's what we wanted. We're not in a position to know that we are not sims. That is, we can't rule out that we're in a simulation. Unfortunately, that doesn't go through given what we've obtained, because we haven't obtained the version of 1 that contains we are sims. We've at best established the probably version of premise 1. If you go with that version, we're in a position to know sim blockers or we're probably sims, then you get to, we're not in a position to know that we're not probably sims. We can't rule out that we're probably sims. I don't know exactly how to regiment that, but it looks like it's saying it's epistemically possible that it's epistemically probable that we are sims. If that's meaningful, I don't know. I don't know exactly what that comes to, but at the very least, it's weak. It's a little bit weaker than what we wanted, which is it's epistemically possible that we are sims. It's got a little bit of weakening in there, and in general, this strategy of trying to get there using knowledge alone, I think is always going to get us to something just a little too weak. Although those of you who do epistemic logic, I'd be very happy to hear of some nice version of epistemic logic that would make this go through. The alternative is to think about credence here. Instead of trying to do it with knowledge, and then maybe it's all going to turn on connections between credence and knowledge. And then here's a natural thing to try and do. Rational credence in we are sims given not sim blockers is high, and then we'll add in the rational credence in there are no sim blockers is substantial. I don't know, substantial means at least pretty big. Doesn't have to be like more than 20%, let's say. A good decent amount above 0. If 1 and 2, then credence in we are sims is near substantial. Remember, given the credence in we are sims given not sim blockers is high, so like say that's 0.99, and sim blockers is 25%, then credence in we are sims will be 24.75%, so still near substantial. If credence in we are sims is near substantial, then you can't know that we are not sims. I don't really think the distinction between substantial and near substantial really matters for a lot here. The thought is just that, our credence in not sim blockers is high enough, let's say 25%, such that giving that credence to we are sims is enough to rule out that we know that we're not sims. If the rational credence in we are sims is near substantial, it's so high that we can't know we're not sims. Conclusion, we can't know we're not sims. That's, I think, it's a better argument. It does turn on there being these relevant thresholds. First, it turns on establishing a claim about the credence in there are no sim blockers is substantial. And then it turns on a connection between credence and knowledge. Here's a slightly more elaborate version of the argument that's close to the best I can do. Let's say the credence, the two key claims that went into the Moravec style reasoning were human-like sims are possible and most human-like beings. If human-like sims are possible, most human-like beings are sims. I guess I'm inclined to think both of those claims are at least, fairly plausible. I think they both have a credence above some threshold. I'm tempted to say for me, they have a credence above 0.5, and it's reasonable to have a credence above 0.5 for them. Anyway, there'll be some case for which rational credence in human-like sims are possible should be higher than K, and rational credence in most human-like beings are sims, given that human-like sims are possible, should be higher than K. Then, given certain plausible independence claim, along with the indifference principle we're talking about, then you'll get to, then the reasonable credence in we are sims is greater than K squared. So the case where K was 0.5, this will get us greater than 0.25. And then we just get, if credence where sims is greater than 0.25, greater than K squared, then we don't know we're not sims. And that's just meant to be a general principle about the connection between credence and knowledge. There's some amount of credence, so that if your credence is below that, the rational credence in a proposition is below that, then you don't know it. I'm inclined to think that's true for, say, 0.75. If it's not rational to have a credence higher than 0.75 in a proposition, then you're not in a position to know it. I know some people, question that kind of connection between knowledge and credence, but I find it plausible, so I'll run with it. Conclusion, we don't know, we're not sims. So that's the best. I was trying to find a path from the simulation argument to we don't know, we're not sims. That's the best I think I can do. Of course, like every philosophical argument, it's not totally conclusive. There are various ways to respond. One thing you might do to respond is to look at the sim blockers, argue that certain sim blockers are actually highly probable. There's no way a simulation could have consciousness. If you establish that, then you make the case it's unlikely that most beings are sims, and you'll resist the argument. Also, if you're using more classic epistemological terrain, you might deny all the relevant inference principles here, certainly a respectable thing to do, or you might deny the relevant connection between credence and knowledge. I think, those last two lines are respectable, but I think, the underlying philosophical thought is the considerations that go into the simulation argument tend to make the simulation hypothesis much more of a live hypothesis than it was before. There's good reason to think that there will actually be many people in simulations in the history of the universe that then make this much less of a science fiction-y, far out skeptical scenario than it was, and its liveness tends to make it much more difficult to know that we're not in a simulation. I would be inclined to hold on to that thought, even in light of these ways of response. There's something to say here about whether you could actually argue in reverse you could start with an anti-skeptical strategy, like more saying, hey, I've got hands, so I know I have hands, reasoning from that to, we know we're not sims, and then to actually use that to say, well, we can know that there have to be sim blockers by reasoning in that direction. I think that's implausible in things like the zebra cases. Morean reasoning doesn't help. Oh, I got a little picture of Russell trying to use this line on Nick Bostrom by saying that inference is the best explanation. Ordinary reality is the simplest hypothesis, so we should run with that. But then Bostrom's got he's got good reason for thinking, hey, there may be many more simulations, and here's a bunch of them in the background. It's kind of very unclear at that point that running through this best explanation line will do anything to knock Bostrom off that position. Anyway, I can say more about this strategy if you like. Anyway, so my conclusion of all this is that the simulation argument at the very least suggests strongly that we don't know we're not in a simulation, and the premise one of the simulation-based Cartesian argument for external world skepticism is correct. So you might think, okay, I've actually given good news for the skeptic. I don't think that's so myself. I think, in fact, the skeptical argument goes wrong in its second premises. But if this is right, it starts to look like responses to the argument must focus on the second premise. This alone doesn't establish simulation realism, which is roughly my line on the second premise. That if we're in a simulation, our ordinary beliefs are correct. So you can't move from we don't know we're not in a simulation to our ordinary beliefs aren't knowledge. But I do think this gives at least some extra reason to take that kind of simulation realism seriously. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks. Sorry, it's not going way too long. Okay. Sure.
For the people over Zoom, if you want to send a direct message to Nevin Kleiman-Haga, he'll read your question out. And if you have a question, put your hand up.
Well, I see we have a couple of things already in the chat.
Jill, do you want to start?
Hey Dave, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask about biosims. So I have a bit of a hard time getting my head around the idea that I could be simulated, but I think I definitely get the idea that I might be living in a simulation. And so that seems to raise the question of, could it be the case that most biological humans are living in a simulation, kind of permanent virtual reality? And I think that maybe could start to seem plausible if you think about the question, would most parents want to put their children in a virtual reality? And when you think about it, I bet a lot of parents think that the world is not good enough for their children, like the real world is not good enough for their children, that it's dangerous in various ways that it just doesn't need to be, like viruses and accidents. And if they could kind of put their children in a kind of training program that would give them all kinds of moral and epistemic virtues as a result of experiences, some of which might be difficult, but only to the extent that it gave their children like richer, better lives. And so then I wonder if you kind of that way make the case that most biological humans could be living in like as biosims.
Yeah, interesting. So it depends on certain psychological hypotheses about parents. I don't know if we have any recent parents here with. I don't know if we have any recent parents here with views on this. You're going to put your baby in a simulation? I don't think I would. Yeah, that would be, the biosim, if you don't like the pure sim hypothesis, then the biosim hypothesis is a kind of a backup. Then I think the main difficulty for the biosim hypothesis compared to the sim hypothesis, pure sim hypothesis, is it just seems like it's going to be more difficult to make all those, to create all those simulations with biological brains connected to them. And we thought, the pure sims are easy. You just set up a world in your computer and watch it go. Whereas for the biosims, you're going to need all this messy biological hookup between brains, bodies, and simulations. So maybe it's going to be less plausible. In the pure sim case, you can imagine people doing 1,000 simulated universes overnight for the sake of science, whereas maybe it's a bit harder to get these 1,000 biosim universes overnight for the sake of science. I don't know, enough nanotechnology, biotechnology, maybe that will become easy too. But your version of it, yeah, that could work. But although I wonder that, I worry now it's not going to get us quite enough for the simulation argument to go through. Is this going to make a, is this going to end, are we going to end up with, like 100 times more people or biosims than are non-sims?
I mean, so maybe the thought is there's a point in technological development at which this becomes easy, right? We don't think of ourselves as being there now, but every society eventually gets there. And then from then on, indefinitely, most creatures, most humans live in virtual reality.
Okay, good. And so how's it, I always had these questions about the matrix, how like reproduction is going to work. Two people meet in VR and then they have a kid in VR. It's not a simulated kid though, then it wouldn't be a biosim anymore. So they're going to need to somehow make sure that a new biological being comes into existence outside the VR by mixing their genetic material in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities. And one part of it surely has to be that if you're simulating reality, then you need to simulate memory as well as other kinds of perception. And then anything could be going on.
Okay, cool. So this is a version of in general, for people who think that consciousness can't be, that if we were pure sims, we wouldn't be conscious. then in general, they're going to have a hard time with the simulation argument. But I see what you're doing is kind of resurrecting a possible version of the simulation hypothesis and the simulation argument, even for them. So that's cool.
Thanks so much. Towards the end of the talk, you said you thought it might be fun to talk about the epistemic logic in the Q&A of that argument. So I thought maybe we could do that for a little.
Fantastic.
So one thing I was thinking about is like, I think one way to think about that argument is involving the KK principle, because like, you know, like I kind of like the principle, look, if there isn't a sim blocker, then it's epistemically possible that you're a sim, and you know that. So then if it's possible that there's no sim blocker, then it's possible that it's possible that, you know, that you're a sim. And then KK says if it's possible that it's possible, then it's possible. So if you had KK, then you could directly go, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could go from it's possible that there's not a sim blocker. You could derive that, you know, it's possible that you're a sim. Now then, even if KK fails, I think immediately one thing the argument just shows is you could just have a skeptical argument about second order knowledge without any principles in epistemic logic, you know? So like, we don't know that we know we're not sims. Well, if closure holds, that means we don't know we know that we have hands, unless you have your reality premise, you know? You know what I mean? So that's like one way to think about it. But then there's another thing. Then you had that cool principle with the probably. And one thing I wanted to flag for your attention is there's some interesting weakenings of KK that have been discussed. So if you let evidential probability be like probability conditional on what you know, one principle you could have that's been discussed is if you know P, then it's then there's a, you know, greater than 0.5 evidential probability that you know P. You know, and there are models that give up KK but have that. But then what I thought was cool is the relevant principle for you would be the opposite flip. So as if you know P, then you know that the evidential probability of P is greater than 0.5. I think that's the thing you were using. And then just one thing I wanted to flag is, you know, so Williamson has these models of improbable knowing, where like you can know P, so that'll violate the first principle. So you can know P even though the evidential probability of knowing P is very low. And those also violate that second principle that you were relying on, that if you know P, then you know that the evidential probability of P is greater than 0.5. So like, you know, he has these models of like the clock, you know, where it's like 3 o'clock. If it's 3 o'clock, you know it's between 2 and 4 o'clock. But if it is 2 o'clock, which is consistent with what you know, then you don't know that. And those kinds of models will be models where you can know something, but you don't know that. So you know it's between 2 and 4, but you don't know that the evidential probability of it being between 2 and 4 is 0.5. I think in that exact example you do, but if you have a wider range where it's like 2 hours on either side, then I think it fails. So anyways, those were some reactions about that.
Yeah, great. That's super helpful, and yeah, I'd love to get the exact details. I was thinking of all this as requiring something. One version of this, yeah, would go via something KK-ish. I was thinking it was not going to be terribly popular.
But the cool thing is, even if you don't have KK, it's still a skeptical argument against any second order knowledge you have hands, which to me, that's very shocking.
That's cool. Yeah, if it's established at the very least that you can't know that you know that you're not in a simulation, that's already interesting. Maybe it doesn't give you full on skepticism, but it gets you to something that was, you know, somehow one step away. I'd like to get more, but yeah, the question is whether, if it turned out that to get more I needed one of these KK-ish principles, maybe something weaker than KK, then yeah, it's probably going to be a matter of looking at those principles just to see how
Jeremy
acceptable they
Goodman
are
has a
to-
paper where he defends that one of the if you know, then probably you know, ruling out improbable knowing, but still having KK failure. So that kind of model might get. But I don't know whether it gets the other order. It might. Yeah, I have to think.
Yeah,
about
I should look at that paper. And yeah, and I was certainly thinking of Williamson's stuff as a view where probably none of this would, but potentially none of this would go through because of the relevant connections between knowledge and probability are going to be weakened. But it would be cool if there's some intermediate KK-ish principle that doesn't suffer from the problems of full KK, but is good enough to make this go through. Yeah, I'd love to talk about this further.
So we have a question over Zoom from Anya Daly. So Anya says, just a thought left of field. Isn't there a hidden premise in this skeptical argument, as in all skeptical arguments, the assumption of working within a dualist metaphysics? So if you successfully critique the dualism, see Merleau-Ponty, then the argument loses all force and interest. This applies to simulation theory also. See Sean Gallagher's critique of this. So I think the question is, how reliant is this argument on the assumption of some kind of dualism?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear more about where the dualist metaphysics is supposed to come in. I think, Bostrom considers himself a materialist. I'm myself sympathetic with some forms of dualism, but I don't really. It's not. I mean, maybe there's a brain-body dualism at play here. If you think about the brain in a vat hypothesis, that somehow the brain we can separate the brain somehow from the body. I don't know if that's the relevant kind of dualism, or if we go with the pure sim hypothesis, if you say that there could be consciousness in a pure sim, I mean, prima facie, that view looks pretty friendly to functionalism or computationalism about the mind, which you'd think of as quite different from dualism. So I don't know, maybe the questioner is thinking of those views as involving some form of dualism too, but I'd need to know more.
Okay. Another question over Zoom from Louis Sartain.
I guess I should stand here so I'm in the picture, at least for people on Zoom. Is that right?
We've got the camera turned so we can see you in both places now.
I see. Okay, very good.
Lewis says, a question for David as well. Does the pure sim hypothesis refer to a simulated creature, meaning artificially created, or simulated meaning merely a figment of another's creation rather than a conscious being with agency? If we go back to the cogito and we find that simulated thinking is still thinking, then is this distinction redundant? After all, will we not still merely be applying an identity to a collection of thoughts with thinking going on being the one thing we have certainty of?
Did you say what the two choices were? One was simulated, meaning artificially
Yeah, I'll read
created.
it out again. I was just reading it for the first time here. So refer to a simulated creature meaning artificially created, or simulated meaning merely a figment of another's creation rather than conscious being with agency.
Yeah, for me, a simulated being is basically just a being based in a computer simulation of the processes of another being, most naturally by, say, simulating the brain and perhaps the body and the environment of another being. So it is an artificially created being, but artificially created in a certain way, namely by simulating the processes of another being. And it's a perfectly legitimate view that merely simulating the processes of another being is not enough to bring, say, a new conscious thinking being into existence. That's one of the sim blockers I talked about. I think maybe that was H3, consciousness can't be simulated. But yeah, my own view is that actually simulating the brain processes of a conscious being will give you a being with consciousness and thought. But yeah, but yeah, it sounds like the questioner probably wants to deny this, in which case they would probably want to go along with the, I think it was the H3 sim blocker, which I didn't spend very much time on here, but where is it? Sorry, H4. H4, human-like consciousness is unsimulable. That is, simulating it doesn't give you consciousness. Sorry, was there that one? Okay, good. Just realized that.
Okay, so then I have a question. Let me pull up my notes here so I can remember my question. So I wondered if there was a way to respond to the simulation argument by appealing to evidence that more direct evidence that we're not simulations. So I think you mentioned maybe most simulations will be impoverished, I think is an objection that I think comes closest to my thought. So here's my thought. So here's one bit of our evidence. Our experiences are very orderly. We don't see a lot of like glitches in the matrix kind of thing. Like I don't see you like flickering or something. I don't see the kinds of things that I might see in simulations. So here's a claim. This evidence is much more likely if most human-like beings are not sims than if most human-like beings are sims. Therefore, this is strong evidence that most human-like beings are not sims. I don't know why this is, but it's probably one of the sim blockers that you mentioned. So it's evidence for one of those sim blockers being true. So given that the content of our experiences is orderly in this way, this might make the probability of that most human-like beings are sim and that therefore that I'm a sim rather low. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that argument.
Yeah, so we can distinguish perfect simulations, the kinds that don't have glitches, from imperfect simulations, which do have glitches. And then, yeah, the fact that our experiences doesn't seem to have that many more glitches, at least seems to be evidence against the hypothesis that we're in an imperfect simulation. I'm still thinking that as long as we have the claim that let's just restrict our relevant simulations to perfect simulations, as long as we have the, we can just rerun the whole argument with perfect simulations and say that, or non-glitchy simulations, and say that, yeah, the chances are that non-glitchy, human-like, non-glitchy simulations are possible. In fact, I guess that's going to be built into human likeness, right? Because human-like experiences are non-glitchy experiences. So I'm thinking of this as, I'm thinking that, yeah, even non-glitchy simulations ought to be possible. And if they're possible, I think that a whole bunch of them ought to be made. Maybe you've got some reason for thinking that, in fact, you would expect non-glitchy experiences to be, simulations to be rare or non-existent. And if you have that, then maybe we'd get a sim blocker. But I guess
yeah, I was
I'm not seeing
thinking
why that's
I was
possible.
thinking something like that. I think there's I think you need an assumption like that. So my thought is that imperfect simulations and perfect simulations aren't independent of each other. That if there are lots of perfect simulations, there are probably also lots of imperfect simulations.
Yeah.
And so I think the fact, if we have evidence against our being in an imperfect simulation, I think that would also give us evidence that there aren't a lot of, sorry, if we have evidence that there aren't a lot of imperfect simulations, I think that's also evidence that there aren't a lot of perfect simulations. So I think you can't like treat that as a fixed point in the argument. But and then the question would be what's the relative? And so if the vast majority of simulations would be imperfect, then this would be a pretty good objection. But if that's not the case, then it would be a weaker objection.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of an objection that Sean Carroll has made, which isn't so much about glitchiness, but just about impoverishedness. We should expect that most simulations are highly impoverished.
Yeah.
They're going to be a very limited, small worlds. They're not going to be, for example, worlds that support further simulations, let alone parent giant universes like ours. So the fact that we find ourselves in what seems to be a very non-impoverished world that supports more simulations, has a giant universe, is itself some reason to think that we're not in a simulation. This is kind of typicality reasoning, like the kind that goes into the doomsday argument or something. It's typical simulations will be impoverished. Therefore, if we're in a simulation, we're in a very atypical one, and I think you ought to resist theories that where you end up being atypical. So that's maybe some evidence that we're not in a simulation. Yeah, I've never been wild about this kind of typicality reasoning even in the doomsday argument, or it also generates a great argument that ants are not conscious, because otherwise typical conscious beings are ants, and we're going to end up being very atypical as conscious beings. So so I would separate that kind of typicality reasoning anyway from the kind of indifference reasoning, which I'm much more fond of. But it is true that there is a interesting challenge from that kind of typicality reasoning to the hypothesis that we're in a simulation.
Thanks.
I'm going to throw myself on the queue at this point. So I'm interested in the prospects of remaining anti-skeptical once I go along with the conclusion. I say, it's pretty likely that we're Sims, and I accept the kind of indifference reasoning. I feel like I don't know how many of these Sims are going to have, been created ex nihilo during beta testing with all these fake memories implanted in them. And so like, even if I accept that a simulated table is a table, so I know that I'm seeing a table right now, I don't know that I grew up in America, and I don't know that I had a coffee this morning, because it could be that I'm just in beta testing and I'm having all these fake memories. And I kind of worry about, so that's one kind of worry, is that I lose a lot of ordinary knowledge. And then I'm also kind of worried about whether the reasoning extends beyond Sims to like Boltzmann brains, which would even destroy my knowledge that I'm seeing a table, even if I accept that simulated tables are tables.
Yeah, actually, the whole last chapter of my book is about these like residual skeptical scenarios that you might still be worried about. So, okay, so the perfect simulation scenario is not a skeptical hypothesis, but what about all these various, not so much imperfect ones, but local simulation hypothesis, shortcut simulation hypotheses where people take a million shortcuts. Maybe they don't actually simulate anything beyond like Melbourne and or me, or maybe they maybe it's just a very local simulation, maybe it's just one since yesterday. And I think you're right. I don't really have a great response to those forms of skepticism. And you might make a plausible case that most simulations will be shortcut simulations as opposed to giant perfect simulations of whole worlds, in which case there might still be a case for being skeptical about knowledge, especially knowledge of things far from home. Maybe we'd be okay with like local perceptual knowledge and so on. At this point, I kind of fall back on, well, at least we don't get global skepticism about the entire external world. We're going to have some bits and pieces to hold on to in each of these scenarios. Maybe you'll get piecemeal global skepticism where you can question every bit of knowledge with some appropriate scenario. That kind of skepticism I find very hard to deal with. But at least we won't end up with scenarios questioning global skepticism all at once. And yeah, the Boltzmann brains are, yeah, really interesting in their own right, because I am committed to Boltzmann brains being scenarios where maybe we don't get anything right about the external world. We believe that all this is going on, but in the Boltzmann brain, maybe it's not. Everything beyond the brain is just random chaos. And then I want to say that, yeah, the right Boltzmann brain, organized appropriately, really would have just all these false beliefs about the external world. Boltzmann brains I want to exclude by a different kind of reasoning, namely abduction. At least this was always my line on this kind of scenario, the random brain hypothesis. Well, that's just a very improbable thing to happen, because then we come up against the fact that some serious scientific hypotheses seem to support the likelihood of Boltzmann brains. And what do you say about that? At this point, I get moved by the worry that it's, you know, turns out to be unstable to actually believe in Boltzmann brains, and therefore there's got to be something wrong with the hypothesis. But exactly what is wrong with it is a complicated thing to figure out. But I do think that, you know, Boltzmann brains especially are a very big challenge here. Way back 20 years ago, in my first paper on this, I said there's this chaos hypothesis that would be the biggest challenge, but fortunately we could rule that out as very unlikely. And then since then, turned out to be, you know, support by some, you know, halfway serious scientific hypothesis. So definitely something to worry about.
So I'm also wondering, like Dimitri, like how skeptical you end up being if you follow the reasoning all the way through. So I might not know anything about the external world, about my world, but aren't I still left with some knowledge, or at least some beliefs about the base universe? The base universe, I have to assume, has technological sophistication, and that brings along with a whole lot of stuff. So I can't be left with like kind of absolute kind of agnosticism about what the base universe is like. Otherwise, I don't have a route to the skeptical conclusion. So I got to the skeptical conclusion by hypothesizing that some base universe had amazing computers, et cetera, and started doing all the things. That aren't I left with at least some assumptions about what that base universe is like in order for that to be to generate that possibility?
So there's, is it an objection to the reasoning that says, you've made a bunch of assumptions about what the base universe is like that you're not entitled to?
No, I'm just wondering how skeptical I
reversed?
end up being. I might be left with some assumptions about some universe. It may not be my world, but there's a base universe, which I'm not, I'm kind of in it, but I'm not like directly acquainted with it. But
okay, because my view is that even if we're in a simulation, you don't have to be that skeptical at all, at least in the perfect simulation case. But you're considering someone who does want to go more skeptical.
yeah, so set aside simulation realism. So
Okay.
bracket that, yeah.
Okay. So bracket that, and then the thought is, okay, we can't know much about our own world because we may well be in a simulation. But you might think, okay, that will at least, well, on the other, if we're in a simulation, then there's at least a universe capable of supporting simulations that we're in. There's a base reality that supports simulations. So then this would get us to, I don't know, maybe some kind of transcendental argument that either, you know, this universe is unsimulated, or there's a base reality that supports simulations.
Yep.
And that's itself interesting. Yeah, that's kind of cool. I don't know. Maybe it's not a giant amount of knowledge to have, but if the simulation hypothesis was the only threat to our knowledge of the external world, then we'd at least have, yeah, some kind of substantial knowledge there.
I know the universe has computers in it. That's a pretty amazing discovery.
Yeah. Okay. Either the external world is fine, or there are computers. Yeah. Okay. Excellent transcendental argument. You should write that book. Yeah, that's good.
So I was kind of wondering to what extent the argument you make sort of generalizes out to, say, other kind of skeptical arguments, or even sort of non-skeptical, I guess, trying to think of a good term, like you look at some of the sort of like old idealist philosophers like Berkeley, or sort of the German idealists like Hegel, that they have this sort of argument that, you know, the world is sort of occurring in the mind of God or something like that. And I guess that's a similar sort of hypothesis, but different, you know, in a bunch of different ways. And so I kind of wonder if those sort of cases, if you can run the same argument through and say, well, okay, depending on the credences we have in, I guess you call them like, yeah, idealist blockers, or you could even take the sort of zebra case. Like you could take all sorts of different like little or larger skeptical cases and maybe input them into the same sort of framework, into the same argument, and see how it works. And if my thought is, if the answer is yes, you can do that, then I mean, maybe it just hinges on the credences, or maybe it goes back to the sort of worry about whether you adopt KK or some weaker version of KK, or you just say, okay, well, this gives us a good reason to be skeptical about like second order knowledge.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess one version of idealism that seems relevant here is something like, I don't know, Berkeley's idealism, where all this is, you know, processes in God's mind. And in that case, you know, God's mind is kind of working in a way analogous to the simulation. You might even think that it is a kind of simulation, but maybe it's an alternative to simulations. And we've got like the God mind hypothesis that, or the cosmic mind hypothesis that, in fact, when we're apparently interacting with the external world, one's actually interacting with a cosmic mind or a divine mind. And that hypothesis does seem parallel to the simulation hypothesis. So one could, in principle, run exactly the kind of reasoning I'm running here with the divine mind hypothesis. Moravec could give an argument, well, in future, many divine minds will be created. I don't know. Is that so? Many like divine mind situations will be created. I don't know. Maybe once we have super intelligent AI, the super intelligent AI will do it all in its head. We'll just conceive of giant universes all at once. We'll conceive of all those beings within there, and the super intelligent AI mind will be like a cosmic mind for the beings in that simulation. Anyway, and then we could question. Then we'd at least get to there are cosmic mind blockers, or we're probably surrounded by a cosmic mind. And maybe in this case, you know, maybe there's a case that cosmic mind blockers would be more plausible in some cases than sim blockers. Although, you know, yeah, I mean, what's the reason to think that those cosmic minds will be easy to create? Although once they happen inside the mind of a super intelligent AI, maybe the gap between that and between a cosmic mind scenario and a simulation scenario itself becomes very blurred. But I do think you're right that at least where that kind of scenario is concerned, one could run something analogous, and then it's just and maybe one can do this for all kinds of scenarios. You can even do it for I'm dreaming, and all this is you could run a simulation argument for the I'm dreaming hypothesis and say either we're probably dreaming or there are dream blockers. And where a dream blocker is something that explains the fact that most people are not in fact in touch with a dream. Now, in that case, I think probably many of the dream blockers would be very unsurprising, unlike the sim blockers. But I do agree that you can find, at least you can find parallel structure in a bunch of cases.
Yeah, I wonder like if you if you have all those sort of cases and you admit that all of them are sort of plausible, then I don't know, maybe you get some kind of anti-skeptical thought that's like, okay, well, now we definitely have to worry about premise 2 because we have to worry about premise 2 for all of them or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I want to run some version of the line I run about premise 2. In principle, I'd like to run that on cosmic mind scenarios and even on some lifelong dream scenarios. It gets trickier over like short-term dream scenarios, which are like Dimitri's cases of just the simulation just since yesterday and so on. But I agree that the structural issues are parallel.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. My view, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that there's vastly more skepticism lurking in this than you're allowing. But the main point I'd want to make is, how are you thinking of us being sims? You define it as we're living in a computer simulation, i.e. we're receiving inputs from and sending outputs to an artificially designed computer. What are the inputs? Are they just the sensory inputs, or are they the whole of our mental contents, including our reasonings? If they include our reasoning, if you conceive of everything being plonked into our minds that's going on by some external source, we don't have any mental autonomy. We're not actually reasoning ourselves. There's just things happening in our minds that feel to us as though we're reasoning, and that's just being given to us from some outside source. Then how are we to think about this reasoning? It seems to me that we're driven to a skeptical sort of position if that's the case. But if you want to say, no, the sort of input I have in mind is just the sort of input we get from our senses, then why? Why is it limited?
Yeah, no, I think that kind of skepticism is actually much more virulent and difficult to defeat than I was here concerned with the kind of skepticism of the senses, where the like in the standard simulation case, you still have a brain which is doing its own thing, or maybe you still have a computational system which is doing its own thing, not directly under the control of, say, some simulator. Rather, the simulator sets things up, lets things go. The brain in the biosim case will get inputs from a simulation, but the brain gets to do its own thing, and likewise for computer simulations. But then you say, well, okay, what about the other case? Yeah, what about the case where the simulators are directly controlling perhaps the brain processes in the case where it's a brain, or perhaps the computer processes, and then basically it looks like then the relevant brain or the relevant AI system is never really doing anything autonomously. Perhaps it's not even thinking. I mean, in this case, I have a hard time. It's far from obvious to me that they could actually have experiences as of being an autonomous brain like this. Too much control of the brain by an outside being. Like if they're controlling every last stage, every last step of neural firing and so on, maybe this is going to break down the kind of causal connection between bits of the brain that's required to have experiences and thoughts at all. So perhaps to get this going with experiences and thoughts like mine, it's going to have to be a weird intermediate kind of control of the system where it just nudges me just often enough in my thoughts that this is consistent with my having genuine thoughts and experiences, but still is going to make me reason, and all kinds of strange. I mean, this is like Descartes' version of the evil demon that makes you, for example, have false mathematical beliefs, right? Yeah. Very unclear how you do that with merely the senses, but if the demon can get inside and manipulate your thoughts in just the right way, surely the demon could make me think 2 + 2 = 5. And yeah, how do I, nothing about this line, the line of thought I've given here, yields a response to that kind of skepticism. And I view that myself as actually a much harder skeptical challenge. So that's basically all to say, I think you're right. I do try and give some little response to that in my book, that somehow the truth is still within the scope of ideal reasoning. But that may be of limited comfort to someone with this kind of skeptical worry.
We have a couple questions over Zoom. We're going to call on one of them now and then do another in person and then come back to the second one. So first, Rude Sherman, who we can see on the screen here, I believe, has a question. Rude, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Great.
I like that last question very much. Thank you, Dave. I'd like to take a step back because the whole discussion is about skepticism about the external world. The assumption being that we do not know if there is an external world, neither that there is, nor that there is not. But I think we can actually know fairly obviously that there cannot be an external world. How? By reductio ad absurdum. If we assume that there is an external world, then it supposedly expands. But what does it expand in? The universe expands in more universe and so on. We get into absurdity. If there's an external world, then supposedly it is causal. But then we get into the problem of what caused this causality. If there's an external world, it exists in time, but then we get the question, what is the first point in time? So in other words, if we assume that there is an external world, we run into all kinds of contradictions and infinite regresses. In other words, absurdities, which seems to point out that there is no external world. And if so, then isn't the whole argument about simulations and the question of skepticism not redundant?
Yeah, that's great. So basically, the external world is more trouble than it's worth. Why not get rid of it? Yeah, certainly there are all these issues that you get into if there is an external world. I suppose one thing that worries me is that exactly the same is true of the internal world. I've spent a lot of my career worrying about the internal world of consciousness, and that seems to generate just about as many paradoxes and antinomies as your external world. Like, the unity of consciousness, how is that even possible? What is it that makes consciousness continuous over time in a single subject? And those questions don't strike me as obviously easier than the ones you raised about the external world. So I worry that if we took your line seriously, we'd say, no external world, no internal world either. What's left? I don't know. Mathematics and logic, maybe, but I think they're probably going to end up generating problems for us too. So I don't know. I do worry that your strategy either overgeneralizes or is going to leave us with extreme nihilism.
Yeah, in a sense, it might be extreme nihilism, because I think the same applies to what you call the internal world. I think you mean mental phenomena, thoughts, feelings, intentions, and so on. And you take them to be kind of self almost. You take human-like beings to have consciousness. I think that is all intrinsic in this other assumption that we exist in the external world. So it's a circular argument, basically. If you would go back to the question, what am I? What are we? If we begin with, but then, as you already said, you would only do the plural to be inclusive. But if you're not being correct, politically correct, and just ask, what am I? Then I think you'll find out that you're consciousness. You're the capacity to be conscious. And you cannot be anything that you are conscious of, because that is all object to you. And if you, as soon as you identify with anything that is object to you, you've made a mistake. And then you get into all these circularity problems and absurdities. So the internal, well, it goes a bit far to explain it, I think, in just in the question and answer to this talk. I think it's all interconnected. I was just giving the external world as a more obvious example.
Okay, well, I'm still holding out some hope that these antinomies and paradoxes for the external world can be resolved, but yeah, but the nihilistic line certainly has its attractions, certainly on some days. Yeah. During the pandemic, I don't know, it's like nihilism about everything begins to seem, yeah, a little more attractive.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
a lot, Dave. This is super interesting. Just a really small kind of thing, I think, just on the master argument for Cartesian skepticism. So, so I think so. You mentioned just like briefly that you're defending what kind of a interesting claim that actually, even if we're in a simulation, most of our common sense beliefs are true. So it's like truth that I have hands. And I'm just wondering, you know, why do we have this response that we have to premise 2 of the Cartesian argument? Where premise 2 is, if we don't know we're not living in a simulation, then we don't know we have hands. Because then you might think, well, no, if we're in a simulation, then we have true beliefs that we have beliefs that we have hands are true. So like in any event, we're going to know that we have hands. So I'm just wondering, are you just thinking like you've done the philosophical therapy? So when you look at premise 2, you're thinking, no, that's not looking good. But like we haven't done the therapy. We don't, you know, but just to say a little bit more about this, the psychology of premise 2.
Yeah. So why are people so tempted by premise 2? And well, I guess the claim underlying it is the intuition that if we're in a simulation, none of the stuff very little of the stuff we ordinarily believe is real. Sorry, very little of the stuff we ordinarily believe is real, or very little of the stuff we ordinarily believe is true, or that we ordinarily perceive as real. And I agree that's intuitive for many people. And but yeah, then that means that I think that intuition is wrong, but I need to explain away the intuition. The best I can do with this is to say that we have this natural model of the world, is what I call like an Edenic world, that there are, you know, phenomenology presents us a world of like primitive colors out there and primitive solidity, primitive colors in a primitive space. And that if we're in a simulation, then the world is not in fact like that. And, you know, perception, with the Edenic content of perception and of belief will end up actually being false. And maybe that explains, at least goes some way towards explaining why we're naturally inclined to find these simulations to be scenarios where, say, we don't have hands or where there aren't chairs, because there really aren't, at least, Edenic objects out there in Edenic space if we're in a simulation. However, I also think that if we're in the world described by current physics, those relevant beliefs are also false, the beliefs with Edenic content. So I don't think that, I think actually the most fundamental, to me, the most fundamental, most compelling aspect of those Cartesian intuitions are intuitions about space. It's an intuition that if we're in a simulation, things are not actually out there in space in front of me, where they seem to be. I think that's a very strong intuition for many people, but I do think of that as an intuition that rests on this Edenic model of space, as this kind of primitive relation that we're acquainted with, and that once and in a certain sense, I want to say that actually with respect to those, you know, those beliefs about the external world, that kind of perceptual content, it is false, and some kind of skepticism is appropriate, except I would then say that, in fact, skepticism is not appropriate because we've got good reason to believe that, from science, to believe that our world is not that way, and that those beliefs are actually false. So I'm making a mess of responding to this, but I think there's probably a lot to the psychology of skepticism, but I would locate one of the deepest roots in this Edenic psychology.
Just so basically, this Just one thing, just follow up. So are you thinking that in every context, it's true to say that I know that I have hands? Like the following description is true in every single context. Kyle knows that he has hands.
Well, I wouldn't make any claim remotely that strong, not least because I haven't given you an argument against skepticism. I've merely given you a response to one argument for external world skepticism based on, and I would, I suppose, the one based on the simulation hypothesis. And I suppose I would like to be able to use that at least to respond to reasons why you might deny that you have hands tied to the simulation hypothesis. Like, I think I don't know I have hands because blah, blah, blah. I want to say those arguments don't go through, but I haven't given you any positive arguments that you know anything at all. So I couldn't make that stronger claim.
I think we have time for one more question over Zoom. This question is from Adrian Flitney. Adrian, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Hello, David. Now, I have to apologize in advance that I was working, so I actually missed most of your talk. So I don't know how much of what I'm going to say is stuff that you've addressed, but I haven't seen it addressed in the literature.
Into the chat for the slides. There were slides, but I don't know if it's too late to put
Right.
I can drop them in the
Anyway,
chat.
so my this is sort of in answer to sort of the Elon Musk argument, who says, "Oh, look, I know about the laws of physics. I know that we've got computers. I can extrapolate into the future and see that these computers can get more powerful, and eventually I can, it's reasonable to assume that we'll be able to create simulations. It's reasonable to assume we'll create lots of them." And then he would say, well, therefore, if we create lots of simulations, then we're likely to be in them. But the problem is, at the very beginning of that argument, I know about the laws of physics assumes that we're not in a simulation. Because if I am in a simulation, I don't know about the laws of physics. I don't know that computers exist. I don't know anything, actually. All I know is, the simulated reality. So my argument would be either we're not in a simulation, and I can, talk about how likely it is that we will be able to create simulations in the future, except I know I'm not one of them. Or we're in a simulation, in which case, well, all bets are off because I don't know anything. And so the main conclusion I would draw is that there's simply no way of assigning probabilities to whether we're in a simulation or not from that argument.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think maybe I could set your argument up against Daniel's point that we can know some things if we're in a simulation. You say if we're in a simulation, all bets are off. But Daniel's point was, well, if we're in a simulation, there's at least a reality out there that contains computers that can run simulations. So we can at least know a little. And at least the way I'm thinking about it, they were at least going to have been designed and constructed by some conscious beings. I guess maybe you can start to question whether we really know those things. But in any case, for the way I've structured the argument, there are all kinds of ways you can question this, question the reasoning. But I've at least tried to regiment the ways of questioning them into these, what I've called these sim blockers. So yes, it could turn out that people out there in the external world didn't create many simulations. Maybe they just created one, but that would involve the sim blocker that they've chosen not to create many simulations. Or maybe the universe only has the power to support one, and that would also correspond to a sim blocker. So I think the thought is, we can't know. There are going to be limits on what we can know about base reality, but there are still only so many ways that this reasoning I've given can fail, and we can regiment that into these sim blockers. And then the claim is going to be, well, for each of those sim blockers, they look highly speculative. We don't know them to obtain, and one can at least reason from there. So maybe that corresponds to the part of the talk before you came in when I brought in the sim blockers, but maybe that would end up being relevant to your question. Thanks, everyone. I saw Claudia had a finger at some point. Did you have a finger at some point? No? I thought you had a finger. Let's see. So is the oh, okay. I thought you had a finger. You said I wasn't.